Hello. Who is this on the other end? For 7 years, the phone had never rung. Until now, the small screen glowed faintly with a number he recognized instantly. Naomi Carter. Naomi, he said quickly. He stood from the table and walked slowly toward the tall glass window overlooking Manhattan. Is that you? There was no reply, only breathing. Daniel's brow tightened slightly. Naomi Carter. Is that really you? He asked again. Where have you been all these years? The words slipped out before he could stop them. 7 years, Naomi. I tried calling you for months after you disappeared. His voice dropped lower. Your apartment was empty. Your number stopped working. He swallowed. Where did you go? Still no answer. Then the breathing shifted, and a small voice spoke. Hello. Daniel froze. The voice was not Naomi's. My name is Annie, the voice continued politely. I'm 6. Daniel blinked once, trying to process what he had just heard. I'm sorry, he said slowly. Did you say Annie? Yes. The little girl sounded nervous but determined to continue. My name is Annie. Daniel turned slightly away from the boardroom, lowering his voice. Annie, how did you get this phone? Oh, Annie said, sounding a little embarrassed. I was just curious. Curious? Yes. I was looking in my mom's kitchen drawer, she explained. And I found this phone. Daniel's chest tightened. My mom keeps it there, Annie continued. She takes it out sometimes at night. Daniel remained silent. She looks at it for a long time, Annie added. And tonight I opened it. Daniel's fingers tightened slightly around the device. And? He asked softly. There was only one number saved, Annie said. I thought that was strange. So I pressed the button to see what would happen. Her voice lowered slightly. I didn't think anyone would answer. Daniel let out a slow breath. A 6-year-old's curiosity had done what 7 years of silence never had. Does your mother know you called me? He asked. No, Annie said immediately. She's sleeping right now. Daniel looked out across the city skyline. Annie, he asked gently. Your mom? She's been all right all these years? There was a pause. Then Annie answered honestly. She was okay before. Daniel listened carefully. But things got hard lately, Annie continued. How so? He asked softly. My mom lost her job, Annie said. She worked at a diner near the harbor. But it closed. Daniel felt something heavy settle in his chest. So now she works a lot of different jobs, Annie went on. Cleaning houses, helping at the grocery store sometimes. She leaves early in the morning and comes home really late. Daniel closed his eyes briefly. And at night, Annie added quietly, she sits at the kitchen table with the phone. Daniel didn't speak. She holds it, Annie said, like she wants to call someone. The silence between them deepened, but she never does. Why not? Daniel asked gently. I don't know, Annie said. She just sighs and turns the phone off. Daniel's throat tightened. For 7 years, he had kept his phone waiting for a call that never came. Daniel took a long breath. Annie, your mother and I know each other. Oh, Annie said with surprise. Yes, Daniel continued quietly. Your mother and I used to know each other. There was a thoughtful pause on the other end. You knew my mom? Annie asked. Yes. Daniel glanced down at the phone in his hand. Years ago. I gave her that phone you found. Really? Yes. Why? Daniel leaned lightly against the window. Because I made her a promise. What kind of promise? The kind you make when you care about someone. Daniel spoke slowly now. I told your mom that if life ever became too difficult, she should call me. Annie was quiet. I told her, Daniel continued, that if things ever got too hard, she could use that phone and I would come help her. Another long pause. But she never calls anyone, Annie said softly. She just holds the phone. Daniel looked out across the endless buildings of Manhattan. And last night, Annie continued, she almost pressed the call button. Daniel's heart skipped once, but then she turned the phone off. So tonight, Annie said gently, I tried calling instead. Daniel stood very still. Annie, he said carefully. Yes? Where is your house? In Harbor Point. The name settled slowly into his mind. A small coastal town several hours north of the city. Daniel nodded to himself. Annie, can you tell me something? What? Is your mom home right now? Yes. She's sleeping in her room. Daniel hesitated for only a second, because suddenly he knew exactly what he needed to do. Annie, he said quietly, I made your mother a promise a long time ago. Yes, the girl said. And I think it's time I keep that promise. There was a pause. What do you mean? Annie asked. Daniel looked down at the phone in his hand. For 7 years I kept this phone waiting, he said softly. And tonight it finally rang. Annie, he said gently. Yes? I'm going to come see your mother. The girl sounded surprised. You are? Yes. Daniel straightened slowly. Because I told her that if life ever became too difficult, she should call me. And tonight, he added quietly, someone finally did. Then Annie asked softly, are you really going to come? Annie, he said gently into the phone. Yes. I'm really going to come. The little girl seemed to consider this very seriously. Okay, she said at last. There was a quiet rustling sound on her end of the call. My house is the blue one, she added helpfully. Near the harbor. Daniel almost smiled. Harbor Point isn't a very big town, is it? He asked. No, Annie replied. Everyone knows everyone. That was the kind of town Harbor Point had always been. Fishing boats, one main street, a diner, a church, a small grocery store where the owner probably knew every family. Very different from Manhattan. Annie, Daniel said, is there someone with you in the house? My stepdad is here, she answered. He's sleeping too. Is he sick? Yes. The word came quietly. Daniel felt the weight of it settle in his chest again. I see. Annie hesitated. Are you coming tonight? She asked. Daniel looked down at his watch. If he left now, the drive would take almost 4 hours. Yes, he said. I'm leaving soon. There was a brief pause. Then Annie spoke in the soft, matter-of-fact tone children sometimes used when discussing difficult things. Mom will probably be mad when she finds out I called you. Daniel's voice softened. I don't think she will. You don't? No. Why not? Daniel looked out over the city again. Because deep down, he suspected Naomi Carter had wanted to press that call button for a very long time. She's been carrying a lot by herself, he said gently, and sometimes people need a little help. Annie seemed satisfied with that answer. Okay, Annie, Daniel added, can you do me a favor? Yes? Don't wake your mom yet. Okay, I want to talk to her when I arrive. All right. The little girl paused again before asking one last question. What's your name? Daniel realized he had never told her. My name is Daniel, he said. Daniel Whitmore. Oh, another thoughtful pause. Mom never said your name, Annie admitted. Daniel felt something twist quietly inside him. That's all right, he said softly. I'll explain everything when I get there. Okay. They said goodbye a moment later. When the call ended, Daniel lowered the phone slowly. The screen went dark again. 7 years of silence had ended with the voice of a 6-year-old girl. If this moment touched your heart, take a second to like this video and tell me in the comments where you are watching from. Your messages help this story reach more people who believe in loyalty, promises, and quiet acts of love. And if you enjoy stories like this, please subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next one. For a moment, he simply stood there. Then he turned. The entire boardroom was watching him. His chief financial officer cleared his throat carefully. Daniel, is everything all right? Daniel slid the old phone into his jacket pocket. No, he said honestly. Then he reached for his car keys. I need to leave. The executives exchanged confused glances. What about the acquisition meeting? Someone asked. It can wait. Daniel walked toward the door. His assistant, Claire, hurried after him into the hallway. Daniel, she said quietly, keeping pace beside him. What's going on? Daniel pressed the elevator button. I'm driving to Harbor Point. Claire blinked. That's 4 hours away. I know. The elevator doors opened. Claire stepped inside with him. Is this about the phone? She asked cautiously. Daniel gave a small nod. Claire had worked for him long enough to know about the device he kept locked in his desk drawer. The elevator began descending. After 7 years? She asked. Yes. And you're leaving a board meeting for it? Yes. Claire studied him for a moment. Then she said something simple. You must have cared about her. Daniel didn't answer immediately. The elevator lights passed floor after floor in silence. Finally, he said quietly, I still do. The doors opened into the lobby. Daniel stepped out and headed toward the private garage beneath the building. Outside, the late afternoon air carried the faint smell of the river. His black sedan waited near the exit ramp. As he unlocked the car, Claire spoke again. Do you want me to cancel tomorrow's meetings? Daniel paused. Then he nodded. Yes. How long will you be gone? Daniel opened the driver's door. I don't know yet. Claire watched him for a moment. Then she said softly, I hope you find what you're looking for. Daniel gave a faint smile. I think I already did. He got into the car and started the engine. The navigation screen lit up. He typed in the destination. Harbor Point. The route appeared instantly. 3 hours and 48 minutes. Daniel pulled out of the garage and merged into evening traffic. The skyline of Manhattan rose behind him like a wall of glass. For 7 years he had kept that phone in his drawer, convinced the promise he made on a cold Brooklyn pier had become meaningless. But tonight a 6-year-old girl had proven otherwise. Traffic thinned as he crossed the bridge heading north. The city lights slowly gave way to darker highways and stretches of quiet road. Daniel drove in silence for nearly 20 minutes before the phone in his pocket buzzed again. He pulled it out quickly. Annie, he answered immediately. Annie? Hi. Her voice sounded a little more relaxed now. I just wanted to tell you something. What is it? My mom woke up for a minute, Annie said. Daniel's grip tightened slightly on the steering wheel. Is she all right? Yes. She asked who I was talking to earlier. And what did you say? I said a friend. Daniel let out a quiet breath. That's good. Annie hesitated. Daniel? Yes? Are you really coming? The question carried a hint of disbelief. Daniel looked down the long, dark highway ahead. Yes, he said. I'm already on the road. There was silence for a moment. Then Annie said something that made the long drive suddenly feel much shorter. Mom used to say you were the kind of person who keeps promises. Daniel felt something warm and painful move through his chest at the same time. I'm trying to be, he said quietly. Outside the windshield, the last lights of the city faded into darkness. And somewhere far ahead, in a small coastal town called Harbor Point, a woman he had not seen in 7 years was waiting without knowing it. Daniel Whitmore had always been a man who moved forward. In business, hesitation cost money. In negotiations, it cost power. The world he lived in rewarded certainty, speed, and the ability to close a deal before the other side even realized what had happened. But that night, as the highway stretched endlessly ahead of him, Daniel found himself thinking about the past more than the future. The road north from Manhattan was nearly empty now. The city lights had faded behind him, replaced by long ribbons of dark highway illuminated only by the steady glow of headlights. His dashboard clock read 8:17 p.m., 3 hours and 20 minutes to Harbor Point. The old phone sat on the passenger seat beside him. For 7 years it had been nothing more than a silent object, something he carried the way people carry photographs they can't bring themselves to throw away. Now, it felt different, alive. Daniel drove in silence for several miles before his thoughts drifted back to the night everything had changed. 7 years earlier, Brooklyn. The air had been cold that evening, the kind of early winter wind that swept in from the East River and slipped easily through coats and scarves. Naomi Carter had been standing at the end of the pier, her arms folded as she looked out across the water toward Manhattan. The skyline had glittered in the distance. Daniel could still remember the way she laughed when she saw him approaching. You're late, she had said. He had raised his hands defensively. I was finishing a meeting. Of course you were, she teased. You're always finishing meetings. Daniel smiled faintly at the memory. Naomi had been the only person in his life who spoke to him that way without hesitation, without concern for titles or money. With her, he had simply been Daniel. He remembered the way the wind had blown strands of her dark hair across her face. You look serious tonight, she had said, studying him carefully. I've been thinking. That sounds dangerous. Daniel had reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small box. Naomi's eyebrows had lifted. Daniel Whitmore, she said slowly. If that's a ring, we need to have a very different conversation. It's not a ring. She had opened the box. Inside was a phone. Simple. Black. Brand new. Naomi looked up at him, confused. You bought me a phone? Yes. Why? Daniel had taken out a second device identical to the first. I bought 2. Naomi frowned slightly. Okay, now I'm definitely confused. Daniel had taken a slow breath. Naomi, he said, I know things between us are complicated. She tilted her head. That's a polite way of saying your family would have a heart attack if they knew we were dating. Daniel didn't deny it, but that doesn't change how I feel about you. Naomi studied him carefully. So what's the phone for? Daniel handed her the device. I want you to keep this. And do what with it? Use it if you ever need me. Naomi laughed softly. I have your number already. Not like this. Daniel held up the second phone. "These two are connected," he explained. "There's only one number saved." She looked down at the screen. "Yours." "Yes." "And the other phone?" Daniel tapped the device in his hand. "It stays with me." Naomi slowly began to understand. "You're serious." "Very." The wind moved quietly across the water. "Daniel," she said softly, "why would I need something like this?" He looked directly at her. "Because life doesn't always go the way we plan." Naomi's expression softened. "And if something happens?" she asked. Daniel's voice had been calm but absolute. "If life ever becomes too difficult, you call me." She searched his face. "And what happens then?" "Then I come." Naomi had looked down at the phone again. "You really think one call could fix everything?" "No." Daniel shook his head slightly. "But sometimes it's enough just knowing someone will answer." The memory faded as the headlights of an oncoming truck swept across Daniel's windshield. He blinked and refocused on the road. The highway signs now listed small coastal towns instead of city exits. Harbor Point was getting closer. Daniel glanced at the passenger seat. The old phone remained exactly where he had placed it earlier. For 7 years, Naomi had kept hers in a drawer. For 7 years, he had kept his in a desk. 2 phones, 1 promise. And somehow it had taken a curious 6-year-old girl to bring that promise back to life. His thoughts drifted again, this time not to the past, but to Annie. Her voice had been careful, thoughtful. Children who grew up around hardship often sounded older than they were. She had spoken about her mother with quiet loyalty, about the diner job, about the late nights, about the phone Naomi held but never used. Daniel tightened his grip slightly on the steering wheel. Naomi had always been stubborn about accepting help. Even when they were together, she had insisted on paying her own bills, buying her own groceries, making her own way in the world. She believed dignity came from independence. Daniel had admired that about her, but now he wondered how many difficult nights she had faced alone. The highway curved along a dark stretch of coastline. The faint smell of salt drifted through the vents. Another road sign appeared ahead. Harbor Point, 42 miles. Daniel felt something shift quietly in his chest. After 7 years, the distance between them had shrunk to less than an hour. His phone buzzed again. This time it was a text message. From Annie. He glanced quickly at the screen at a stoplight. Mom fell asleep again. House is quiet. Drive safe. Daniel smiled faintly. 6-year-olds didn't usually send messages like that. But Annie clearly understood something important was happening tonight. He typed a short reply when the light turned red again. Almost there. Take care of your mom. The message delivered instantly. The light turned green. Daniel pressed the accelerator and the car moved forward into the dark coastal highway. Ahead of him lay Harbor Point. Behind him lay 7 years of unanswered questions. But for the first time in a long time, Daniel Whitmore felt something unexpected. Not regret, not anger. Something simpler. Hope. The road into Harbor Point narrowed long before Daniel Whitmore saw the town itself. The wide highway gradually gave way to a smaller coastal road lined with dark trees and quiet houses set back from the pavement. The air smelled faintly of salt and wet wood, the unmistakable scent of towns that lived beside the ocean. Daniel slowed the car slightly as he passed the wooden welcome sign at the edge of town. Welcome to Harbor Point. Population 3,482. Small towns always had a different rhythm from cities. Even at night, you could feel it. The quiet patience of places where people had known each other for generations. Daniel drove past a row of dim storefronts, a diner with its neon sign half lit, a bait shop with fishing nets hanging in the window, a small church whose white steeple stood out against the dark sky. It was the kind of town where everyone would notice a stranger's car. His phone buzzed softly on the passenger seat. Annie again. He answered through the car speaker. Hi, Annie. Her voice sounded relieved. You're still coming? Yes, Daniel said. I just entered Harbor Point. Oh, there was a pause. I think I heard your car. Daniel smiled faintly. You can hear cars from your house? Sometimes, Annie said proudly. Our street is really quiet. That sounds nice. It is, she said. Except when the wind gets loud. Daniel slowed the car as he approached the harbor road. Fishing boats rocked gently against wooden docks under dim yellow lights. A few men in thick jackets were tying ropes, finishing the last work of the day. It was a different world from Manhattan. Annie, Daniel said, you mentioned your house is blue? Yes. Near the water? Yes. She paused. There's a red mailbox in front. That helps. And a big tree, Annie added. Daniel nodded even though she couldn't see him. I think I'll find it. Okay. There was a small hesitation before Annie spoke again. Daniel? Yes. My mom. She's been really tired lately. Daniel felt his chest tighten slightly. Still sleeping? Yes. She fell asleep on the couch tonight. He imagined Naomi there curled up under a blanket after another exhausting day. Did she eat dinner? He asked. Just a little. Daniel slowed the car again as he turned onto a smaller residential street. Annie, he said gently, you're taking good care of her. The girl sounded shy when she answered. I try. A quiet pride lived in those two words. Daniel noticed something then that he hadn't earlier. The responsibility in her voice. Children who grew up in easy homes didn't sound like that. Your stepdad, Daniel said carefully. How is he doing? Some days are better, Annie replied. Tonight he's sleeping. I see. Daniel spotted a row of small houses along the water's edge, and then he saw it. A blue house, faded paint, a small porch light glowing beside the front door, and a red mailbox leaning slightly to one side. I think I found it, he said softly. You did? Annie's voice brightened instantly. Yes, I'm outside. Oh, Daniel pulled the car to the curb and turned off the engine. For a moment he remained sitting there, his hands resting lightly on the steering wheel. 7 years. 7 years of unanswered questions sat inside that small house. Annie, he said quietly, I'm going to come to the door. Okay. And okay. I'll explain everything. Okay. He ended the call and stepped out of the car. The night air was colder near the water. The porch light illuminated the small front yard, where a bicycle leaned against the railing. Training wheels. Daniel noticed that detail immediately. A child's world. He walked slowly up the path. The wooden steps creaked softly as he climbed onto the porch. For a brief moment he stood there, looking at the door. 7 years ago, Naomi Carter had disappeared from his life without a word. Tonight he was standing on her porch. Before he could knock, the door opened. Annie stood there. She was smaller than he expected. 6 years old, wearing oversized pajamas with tiny stars on them. Her hair was tied back loosely, and her dark eyes studied him with the careful curiosity children often reserved for strangers. You're Daniel, she said. Daniel nodded. And you must be Annie. She looked relieved. You're real. Daniel almost laughed. Yes. For a moment they simply looked at each other. Then Annie stepped aside and opened the door wider. You should come inside, she said. Daniel entered quietly. The house was modest but warm. A small living room with worn furniture, a lamp glowing beside the couch, children's drawings taped to the wall near the hallway. Daniel's eyes moved slowly around the room. Every detail spoke of a life built carefully, one day at a time. Mom's over there, Annie whispered. Daniel followed her gaze. Naomi Carter lay asleep on the couch beneath a thin blanket. The soft lamplight fell across her face. She looked thinner than he remembered, more tired, but unmistakably the same woman. Daniel felt the breath leave his chest. For a moment the past and present collided so sharply he had to steady himself. 7 years vanished in an instant. Naomi shifted slightly in her sleep but didn't wake. Annie watched him carefully. You know her, she said quietly. Daniel nodded. Yes, she's my friend. Annie seemed satisfied with that explanation. She talks about you sometimes, the girl added softly. Daniel looked at her. What does she say? Annie shrugged. She says you were someone who kept promises. Daniel felt the weight of those words settle deeply in his chest. For 7 years, Naomi had believed that. Even while never making the call, he stepped closer to the couch. Naomi stirred again. Her eyes slowly opened. For a moment she looked confused. Then she saw him, and everything in her expression changed. Daniel? The room fell completely silent. Naomi Carter sat up slowly on the couch, the blanket slipping from her shoulders as if gravity itself had suddenly become uncertain. For several seconds she simply stared at him. The room was quiet except for the distant sound of waves hitting the harbor and the soft hum of an old refrigerator somewhere in the kitchen. Daniel, she said again, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel stood a few feet away. His hands relaxed at his sides, though the tension in his chest felt anything but calm. Yes, he said gently. Naomi blinked, as if trying to bring the image in front of her into focus. 7 years had passed, yet the first emotion that crossed her face was not anger. It was disbelief. How? She began. Her gaze moved past him for a moment. Annie? The little girl stepped closer to the couch. I called him, Annie said honestly. Naomi's eyes widened. You did what? I found the phone, Annie explained quickly. The one in the drawer. Naomi's hand instinctively moved toward the kitchen, as if the drawer were still there waiting for her. You shouldn't have, she started, but the words stopped halfway, because Daniel was standing in her living room, real, not a memory, not a voice from years ago. Daniel spoke softly. It's all right. Naomi looked back at him, the confusion in her expression slowly shifting towards something more complicated. You came, she said quietly. Daniel nodded once. You called. Naomi looked at Annie again. She called, Naomi corrected. Annie lowered her head slightly. I was curious, she said softly. Naomi let out a long breath and rubbed her temples. Oh my goodness. The room remained quiet. Finally, Naomi looked back up at Daniel. You drove all the way here? Yes. How long were you on the road? About 4 hours. Naomi shook her head slowly, as if trying to make sense of the moment. You shouldn't have done that. Daniel smiled faintly. I promised I would. The words landed gently but firmly in the room. Naomi looked down at her hands. For a moment no one spoke. Then Annie broke the silence. I told him you've been tired, she said. Naomi looked at her daughter again. You told him that? And about the diner closing, Annie added. Naomi closed her eyes briefly. That was not something you needed to share. Annie looked uncertain. I thought he should know. Daniel stepped forward slightly. She was just being honest, he said quietly. Naomi glanced up at him. And you drove 4 hours because a 6-year-old was honest? Daniel considered that. Yes. Naomi gave a short breath that was almost a laugh. You haven't changed. Neither have you, Daniel said. That wasn't entirely true. He could see the years on her face, the exhaustion in her posture, the quiet strain that comes from carrying too much responsibility for too long. But the determination in her eyes was the same. Naomi pulled the blanket tighter around herself. You look like you run the world now, she said. Daniel shrugged slightly. I run a company. That's not what the internet says. Daniel smiled faintly again. I try not to believe everything the internet says. Annie watched the conversation carefully, her eyes moving back and forth between them. You two really do know each other, she said. Naomi looked at her daughter with a tired smile. Yes, Daniel added quietly. A long time ago, Annie climbed onto the couch beside her mother. Mom used to talk about someone named Daniel, she said. Naomi's head turned quickly. I did. Sometimes, Annie replied. When? Mostly when you thought I was asleep. Naomi's cheeks colored slightly. Daniel felt something shift in his chest again. Mom said you were kind, Annie continued. Naomi cleared her throat. Annie, and that you kept your word, the girl finished. The room fell quiet once more. Daniel finally spoke. Annie also told me about the diner. Naomi's shoulders stiffened slightly. That's not your problem. It might be. No, Naomi said firmly. It isn't. Daniel nodded slowly. I understand why you'd say that. Because it's true. Naomi, he said gently. You were working 2 jobs. Naomi looked away. You always did too much. That's called surviving, she replied. Daniel studied her carefully. And holding the phone every night? Naomi froze. For a moment she said nothing. Annie looked between them curiously. I told him about that, she admitted. Naomi exhaled slowly. Yes, she said quietly. I suppose you did. Daniel spoke softly. Why didn't you call? Naomi's gaze moved to the small hallway window. Beyond it, the harbor lights shimmered across dark water. Because promises can be dangerous things, she said. Daniel frowned slightly. That wasn't how we meant it. Naomi looked back at him. You were offering help. Yes, and I would have taken it. Of course. But then what? She asked quietly. Daniel didn't answer immediately. Your family hated me, Daniel. The words were calm, but they carried the weight of years. Your world was never going to accept someone like me. Daniel didn't deny it, but that didn't mean it meant everything, Naomi said gently. She gestured toward the house around them. This life may not look impressive to you. It does, Daniel said quietly. Naomi paused. Then she asked something that had clearly lived in her mind for years. Why did you keep the phone? Daniel reached slowly into his jacket pocket. He pulled out the old device and placed it on the coffee table. The same model, the same worn edges. Naomi stared at it. You kept it, she whispered. For 7 years. Daniel nodded. Because I meant what I said that night. Naomi's eyes softened. Annie looked between the two phones as if she had just discovered a secret map. So there were two? She asked. Daniel smiled slightly. Yes. One for your mom, and one for me. Annie considered that carefully. Then she said something very simple. Well, it's good I called then. Daniel and Naomi both looked at her. For the first time that night, Naomi laughed quietly. Yes, she said. I suppose it is. Naomi's laughter faded slowly, leaving a softer silence behind it. The small living room felt warmer now, though the ocean wind outside continued to brush quietly against the windows. Annie remained curled beside her mother on the couch, studying Daniel with the same thoughtful curiosity she had shown since he walked through the door. Daniel sat in the worn armchair across from them. The two identical phones rested on the coffee table between them like quiet witnesses to a promise that had waited 7 years to be fulfilled. For a while, none of them spoke. Then Annie broke the silence again. Mom, she said softly, you should tell him about Dad. Naomi stiffened slightly. Daniel noticed the change immediately. Your stepfather? He asked gently. Annie nodded. He's in the bedroom. Naomi sighed, the sound tired but patient. He's been sick for almost a year, she explained. What happened? Daniel asked. Lung disease, Naomi said quietly. Years working construction finally caught up with him. Daniel leaned forward slightly, listening carefully. He can't work anymore, Naomi continued. Most days he barely leaves the bed. Annie's small hand slipped into her mother's. So Mom works, the girl said matter-of-factly. Naomi glanced at her daughter with a faint smile. Yes, Mom works. Daniel studied Naomi carefully. How many jobs? Naomi hesitated. Enough. That sounds like more than one. Naomi gave a tired shrug. I cleaned houses in the mornings, the diner in the afternoons. Sometimes I helped the grocery store stock shelves at night. Daniel felt something tighten in his chest. That's 3 jobs. Was. Naomi corrected quietly. Daniel raised his eyebrows. The diner closed last month. Naomi nodded. The owner couldn't afford to keep it open. The room fell silent again. Annie leaned slightly against her mother's shoulder. Mom says we'll be okay, she said. Naomi squeezed her hand gently. We will be. Daniel believed that Naomi believed it, but he also knew the cost of carrying a family alone for too long. Naomi, he said carefully, why didn't you ever call? She looked at the phone on the coffee table, then back at him. Because the moment I did, she said quietly, everything would have changed. Daniel frowned slightly. That was the point. No, Naomi said softly. That was the danger. Daniel didn't interrupt. Naomi leaned back against the couch. You gave me that phone on a cold night in Brooklyn, she said. You told me if life ever became too difficult, I should call. I meant it. I know. Naomi's voice remained calm, but her eyes held a depth of memory. But Daniel, you and I both knew something else too. What? Your family. Daniel didn't respond. You may not remember how powerful your last name sounded to people like me, Naomi continued. But I do. Daniel's jaw tightened slightly. My mother never approved. Naomi laughed quietly. That's one way to say it. She looked around the small living room. I left before she had the chance to make my life impossible. Daniel studied her carefully. She threatened you. Naomi didn't answer directly. Instead, she said, sometimes walking away is easier than fighting someone with more power. Daniel felt anger flicker somewhere deep inside him, but Naomi raised a hand gently. Don't, she said. Don't what? Don't carry anger for something that happened years ago. Daniel looked down at the phone on the table. You disappeared without a word. Naomi's expression softened. That was the only way to make sure you didn't follow me. Annie watched both of them carefully, clearly aware that something important lived inside the conversation even if she didn't understand all the details. Mom cried sometimes, Annie said quietly. Naomi turned toward her daughter. Annie, I saw you, the girl continued. Late at night. Naomi sighed softly. You were supposed to be asleep. I tried, Annie said honestly. Daniel listened without speaking. And sometimes, Annie added, you held the phone. Naomi looked down. I remember. And you almost called. Annie said, yes. Why didn't you? Naomi was silent for a moment. Then she answered with quiet honesty. Because I didn't want to change Daniel's life. Daniel looked up sharply. You think helping you would have ruined my life? Naomi shook her head. No. Then what? I thought it would complicate it. Daniel leaned forward. My life has been complicated for years. Naomi met his eyes. Yes, she said softly. But it was your choice. The truth in those words settled between them. Annie looked at the two adults for a long moment. Then she asked something simple. Are you two friends again now? Daniel glanced at Naomi. Naomi gave a small smile. I think we never stopped being friends. Daniel nodded slowly. Some friendships just take longer to come back. Annie seemed satisfied with that answer. Good, she said. Then she yawned. A long, heavy yawn that reminded everyone in the room that she was still only 6 years old. Naomi brushed Annie's hair gently. It's late. I'm not sleepy. Annie insisted immediately. You are. A little. Daniel smiled. Naomi stood carefully from the couch. I should put her to bed. Annie wrapped her arms around her mother's waist. Will Daniel still be here when I wake up? Daniel answered before Naomi could. Yes. Annie studied his face carefully, as if measuring the truth of that promise. Then she nodded. Okay. Naomi guided her daughter down the hallway. Daniel remained in the quiet living room. The sound of soft footsteps faded into the back of the house. For the first time since arriving, he allowed himself to relax slightly into the chair. The small home carried the scent of laundry soap and ocean air. A life built slowly, carefully. A few minutes later, Naomi returned. She sat down across from him. For a while, they simply looked at each other again. 7 years of distance still lived quietly between them, but it felt smaller now. You came a long way tonight, Naomi said. Daniel nodded. You never called. No, but Annie did. Naomi smiled faintly. She always was curious. Daniel looked down at the phone again. The promise still counted. Naomi leaned back in the couch. I suppose it did. Outside, the quiet harbor wind moved through the night, and for the first time in years, neither of them felt completely alone. Naomi returned to the living room quietly after tucking Annie into bed. The hallway light behind her dimmed as she gently pulled the bedroom door halfway closed. For a moment she stood there, leaning lightly against the wall, as if collecting her thoughts before stepping fully back into the room. Daniel was still sitting in the same chair, the old phone resting on the coffee table in front of him. He had not moved much since she left. The quiet of the house seemed to press gently around them now that Annie's voice was gone. Naomi crossed the room and sat down again on the couch. She fell asleep quickly, she said softly. Daniel nodded. She had a long day. Naomi smiled faintly. She's had a lot of those lately. A soft wind rattled the window pane beside the couch. The harbor was close enough that the tide could sometimes be heard at night if the town was quiet enough. For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. Then Naomi looked toward the coffee table again. You really kept it all this time, she said. Daniel followed her gaze to the phone. Yes. 7 years. Yes. Naomi shook her head slowly. I almost threw mine away once. Daniel looked up. When? About 2 years after I left the city, she said. What changed your mind? Naomi thought for a moment before answering. I realized throwing it away wouldn't actually change anything. Daniel waited. The past doesn't disappear just because you remove the evidence, she added quietly. Daniel understood that feeling very well. Why did you keep yours? Naomi asked after a moment. Daniel leaned back slightly in the chair. At first I thought you might call. And after that, I kept thinking maybe I would hear from you again. Naomi studied his face. You never tried to find me? Daniel hesitated. I tried. Naomi raised an eyebrow slightly. And? Your trail ended quickly. She wasn't surprised. I made sure it would. Daniel nodded slowly. That doesn't surprise me either. Naomi leaned forward slightly and rested her elbows on her knees. Daniel, when I left New York, I needed to disappear. I know. No, she said gently. I don't think you do. Daniel looked at her. For someone with your last name, walking away from everything is dramatic. For someone like me, it's survival. Daniel absorbed that quietly. Naomi continued. Harbor Point was the first place where nobody asked questions. That must have been a relief. It was. She glanced around the small room. I built a life here. Daniel nodded. I can see that. Naomi smiled faintly. Not a glamorous one. I didn't expect glamour. You were surrounded by it when we met. Daniel shrugged slightly. That world gets old faster than people think. Naomi leaned back against the couch again. I used to wonder what happened to you. Daniel tilted his head slightly. You had the internet. Yes, she admitted, but I tried not to look. Why? Because every time I did, It reminded me how far apart our lives had become. Daniel studied her carefully. Did you ever regret leaving? Naomi's eyes moved toward the hallway where Annie slept. No. Daniel followed her gaze. Because of her. Yes. Naomi's voice softened. Annie deserves a quiet life. Daniel nodded slowly. She seems like a remarkable kid. Naomi smiled. She is. The smile lingered for a moment before fading slightly. She grew up faster than I wanted. Daniel understood what she meant. Children raised around struggle often learned responsibility earlier than they should. She takes care of you, he said. Naomi chuckled quietly. More than she should have to. Daniel leaned forward slightly. You've been carrying too much. Naomi shook her head gently. Most parents do. But 3 jobs? Naomi shrugged. That was temporary. Temporary doesn't make it easier. No, she admitted. They sat in silence again for a moment. Then Daniel asked something he had been wondering since Annie first mentioned it. Your husband. Naomi's posture stiffened slightly. He's a good man. I didn't say he wasn't. He came into our lives when things were already difficult, Naomi said. And he stayed. Daniel nodded. That matters. Yes. Naomi looked toward the hallway again. His name is Mark. Daniel waited. He worked construction most of his life. And now he's sick. Yes. Naomi's voice grew softer. The doctors say the damage to his lungs is permanent. Daniel felt the quiet heaviness of that reality settle in the room. Does he know about me? Daniel asked carefully. Naomi thought for a moment. He knows there was someone important in my past. Daniel nodded. That's fair. Naomi studied him again. You're handling this better than I expected. Daniel smiled faintly. What were you expecting? Anger. I had 7 years to work through that. Naomi seemed to accept that answer. Then she asked quietly, what happens now? Daniel leaned back in the chair again. Tonight? Yes. I stay at the motel down the road. Naomi raised an eyebrow. You don't need to do that. I'm not leaving town tonight. Naomi was quiet for a moment. And tomorrow? Daniel looked at the 2 phones on the coffee table. Tomorrow we start figuring things out. Naomi watched him carefully. You always were very certain about things. Daniel gave a small smile. Not always. Just when it matters. Daniel didn't disagree. Naomi sighed softly. You know Harbor Point is going to notice you. Daniel glanced toward the window. That's all right. Small towns talk. I've survived worse. Naomi laughed quietly. That sounds like the Daniel I remember. Daniel stood slowly. I should let you get some rest. Naomi looked surprised. You're leaving already? For tonight. Naomi walked with him to the door. The night air drifted in as she opened it. Daniel stepped onto the porch, then turned back toward her. Naomi. Yes? The promise still stands. She looked at him carefully. I know. Daniel nodded once. Then he walked down the wooden steps toward his car. Behind him, Naomi remained standing in the doorway, watching the man who had returned to her life after 7 years of silence. Daniel drove slowly through Harbor Point that night. The town had already fallen into the quiet rhythm that only small coastal places seem to understand. Porch lights glowed softly along narrow streets. A few trucks were parked outside modest houses. Somewhere in the distance, a buoy bell rang gently from the harbor. It was nearly midnight. Daniel had expected to leave Naomi's house feeling unsettled. 7 years of unanswered questions rarely ended with peaceful conversations. But instead, as he guided the car down the empty road toward the small motel near the marina, he felt something unfamiliar, a sense of unfinished responsibility. Not guilt, not regret, something steadier. The promise he had made on a cold Brooklyn pier had not disappeared with time. It had simply waited. He pulled into the parking lot of Harborview Motel, a small 2-story building overlooking the dark water. The neon vacancy sign buzzed faintly above the office window. Inside, the night clerk barely looked up from a newspaper when Daniel walked in. Evening, the man said casually. Evening, Daniel replied. Room? Yes. The clerk slid a key across the counter. Room 7. Coffee machine works if you kick it once. Daniel smiled slightly. Good to know. 5 minutes later, he stepped into the quiet motel room. It was simple but clean. A bed, a small desk, a lamp beside the window facing the harbor. Daniel set his jacket over the chair and placed the old phone on the bedside table. For a long time, he stood there looking at it. 7 years. He had built a company worth billions during those years. He had negotiated mergers, faced down corporate boards, traveled between cities where every hotel room looked the same. But this small device had remained the one constant thing he never allowed himself to throw away. Now it had finally rung. Daniel sat on the edge of the bed and loosened his tie. The night air through the slightly open window carried the distant scent of salt and seaweed. His thoughts returned to Naomi. She had looked tired, stronger than he expected, but tired. The kind of exhaustion that comes from carrying responsibility every single day without anyone to help shoulder the weight. And Annie. Daniel found himself smiling faintly as he remembered the girl's serious expression when she opened the door. "You're real." Children rarely hid what they thought. The phone on the bedside table buzzed softly. Daniel picked it up immediately. A text message. From Annie. "Mom says thank you for coming." Daniel leaned back against the headboard. He typed slowly. "You're welcome." A few seconds passed before another message appeared. "Mom says she didn't expect you to still remember." Daniel paused before replying. Some promises are hard to forget. The 3 small dots on the screen appeared again. "Mom says you were always stubborn." Daniel chuckled quietly. "That sounds accurate." A moment later, another message appeared. Annie again. "Mom says I should be asleep." Daniel typed back. "She's right. You should." The reply came almost instantly. "Okay. Good night, Daniel." Daniel hesitated before sending his final message. "Good night, Annie. Sleep well." The screen went dark again. Daniel set the phone back on the table and walked over to the window. The harbor stretched quietly beneath the night sky. Fishing boats rocked gently in their slips, ropes creaking softly against wooden docks. For the first time in many years, Daniel allowed himself to imagine something he had stopped considering long ago. What might have happened if Naomi had never left New York? If the world had been simpler? If 2 identical phones had not spent 7 years waiting in silence? But imagining the past was rarely useful. The present was what mattered, and tomorrow would bring new decisions. Daniel turned off the lamp and lay down on the bed. Sleep came slowly, not because his mind was racing, but because it had too much to process. Naomi's quiet strength, Annie's honesty, the fragile balance of a life built carefully in a small town far from the world he controlled. And Mark. Daniel hadn't met him yet, but the man's presence hung quietly over everything. A husband, a father figure, a man fighting illness. Daniel closed his eyes. Life had a strange way of rearranging itself when you least expected it. Morning arrived earlier than Daniel expected. Sunlight filtered through the motel curtains, reflecting off the water outside. He checked the time. 6:02 a.m. Daniel was rarely awake this early unless he was boarding a flight. But Harbor Point moved with the rhythm of fishermen and dock workers. The town woke with the sun. He dressed quickly and stepped outside. The harbor was alive now. Boats leaving the docks, gulls circling overhead, the smell of coffee drifting from a small cafe across the street. Daniel walked toward it. Inside, a handful of locals sat at the counter drinking coffee and discussing weather, tides, and the latest town gossip. When Daniel entered, several heads turned. Strangers were noticed immediately in towns like this. The waitress approached with a friendly smile. "Morning," she said. "Morning. Coffee?" "Yes, please." She poured a cup and set it in front of him. "You passing through?" Daniel considered the question. "Not exactly." She nodded as if that answer made perfect sense. "Most folks who stop here are either fishermen or lost." Daniel smiled slightly. "Which one do I look like?" "Neither," she said. "You look like someone with business." Daniel took a sip of the coffee. She wasn't wrong. Outside the cafe window, the harbor road stretched toward the small blue house where Naomi and Annie lived. And somewhere inside that house, a little girl who believed in promises was probably just waking up. Daniel Whitmore finished his coffee slowly, because today would be the first real day of something none of them had planned. And in Harbor Point, news had a way of spreading faster than the tide. Daniel Whitmore finished his coffee just as the morning sun began to rise over the harbor. The small cafe had grown busier in the last 20 minutes. Fishermen in worn jackets came and went, ordering eggs and coffee before heading toward their boats. A radio behind the counter played soft country music, the kind of background sound that made a place feel lived in. Daniel sat quietly at the end of the counter, listening more than speaking. Small towns revealed themselves slowly. The waitress who had served him earlier returned with the coffee pot. "Need a refill?" she asked. "Yes, thank you." She poured another cup and glanced toward the window where Daniel had been looking. "You staring down Harbor Street like that?" she said casually. "I'm guessing you're visiting someone." Daniel smiled faintly. You could say that. She followed his gaze. Blue house near the water? Daniel raised an eyebrow. You know it? Everyone knows it. She leaned against the counter slightly. Naomi Carter lives there. Daniel nodded. I figured. The waitress studied him for a moment longer, then smiled, knowingly. Town this small, she said. Nothing stays mysterious very long. Daniel didn't doubt that. Naomi's a good woman, the waitress added. Works harder than anyone I know. Daniel's expression softened. That sounds like her. The waitress straightened. Well, if you're heading over there, tell Annie the diner lady says hello. Daniel blinked. You know Annie too? Of course I do, she laughed. Everyone in Harbor Point knows Annie. Daniel paid for his coffee a few minutes later and stepped back into the morning air. The town was fully awake now. Children walking toward the small elementary school down the street. Pickup trucks rolling toward the marina, the steady hum of a place where everyone knew what they were doing with their day. Daniel walked slowly toward his car. For years his life had moved according to a calendar filled months in advance, but today felt different. Unscheduled, uncertain, and strangely important. He drove down Harbor Street again, passing the same row of houses he had seen the night before. The blue house came into view quickly. The porch light was now off. A small bicycle leaned against the railing. Daniel parked along the curb and stepped out of the car. The morning air carried the crisp scent of the ocean. Before he could reach the porch steps, the front door opened. Annie stepped outside. Her hair was slightly messy from sleep, and she wore the same oversized pajamas as the night before. But her face lit up instantly when she saw him. You came back, Daniel smiled. Good morning, Annie. She ran down the porch steps and stopped a few feet in front of him. I knew you would. I said I would. Annie nodded seriously. You keep promises. Daniel crouched slightly so they were at eye level. Your mom awake yet? Not really, Annie said. She was making coffee. Daniel chuckled softly. That counts as awake. Annie looked toward the street behind him. Where did you sleep? At the motel by the harbor. Oh. She considered that. You could have slept here. Daniel smiled. That might have surprised your mom. Annie giggled. That's true. The screen door opened behind them. Naomi stepped onto the porch. Her hair was pulled back loosely, and she wore a simple sweater over jeans. A coffee mug rested in one hand. For a moment, she simply watched them. You're up early, she said to Annie. I wanted to see if Daniel came back. Naomi looked at Daniel. You didn't have to rush over here this early. Daniel shrugged lightly. I was already awake. Naomi nodded. Coffee? Yes, please. She stepped aside and gestured toward the door. Daniel followed Annie into the house. The morning light made the small living room feel warmer than it had the night before. Naomi placed a fresh mug on the kitchen table and poured coffee. Daniel sat down across from her while Annie climbed onto the chair beside them. For a few moments, the three of them simply sat quietly. Then Naomi spoke. You probably noticed something about Harbor Point already. Daniel took a sip of coffee. Everyone knows everyone. Naomi nodded. And they'll know about you soon. That doesn't worry me. Naomi smiled faintly. It should a little. Annie looked between them curiously. Why? Naomi brushed her daughter's hair gently. Because when something new happens in a small town, people talk about it. Annie nodded thoughtfully. That's true. Daniel set his coffee mug down. I don't mind people talking. Naomi studied him carefully. You say that now. Daniel met her gaze calmly. I've spent most of my life in rooms where people talk about me. That's different. How? Because here, Naomi said quietly, people care about each other. Daniel understood what she meant. In cities like New York, curiosity often came with ambition. In small towns, it came with concern. Annie suddenly brightened. Daniel. Yes? You haven't met my dad yet. Naomi's expression shifted slightly. Annie, she said gently. It's okay, Daniel said. He looked at Naomi. I'd like to meet him. Naomi hesitated for a moment. He's still resting. That's fine. Annie stood from her chair. I'll show you where his room is. Naomi watched Daniel carefully. You don't have to do this today. Daniel stood slowly. Yes, he said quietly. I do, because some promises, once awakened, didn't allow themselves to be ignored again. Annie led the way down the narrow hallway with the quiet confidence of a child who knew every inch of her home. Daniel followed a few steps behind while Naomi remained in the kitchen doorway, watching carefully. The hallway was simple family photographs on the wall, a small shelf holding a few school trophies and a stack of children's books. One photo caught Daniel's attention for a moment. Naomi stood beside a tall man with broad shoulders and a gentle smile. Annie, much younger in the picture, sat on his shoulders laughing. Mark, Daniel realized. The bedroom door at the end of the hall was slightly open. Annie slowed and pushed it gently with her hand. "My dad's still resting," she whispered. Daniel stepped quietly to the doorway. The room was dim, the curtains only partially open to the morning light. A man lay in the bed, propped slightly upright by pillows. An oxygen tube ran beneath his nose, the machine beside the bed humming softly. Mark Carter looked older than Daniel expected. His hair had begun to gray at the temples, and illness had taken weight from his face. But there was still strength in the structure of his shoulders. Annie approached the bed. "Dad?" she said softly. Mark stirred slightly and opened his eyes. "Well, there's my favorite girl," he said hoarsely. Annie smiled. "Good morning." Mark noticed Daniel standing in the doorway. For a moment his expression tightened with confusion. "Morning," Mark said carefully. Daniel stepped forward. "Good morning." Annie looked between them. "Dad, this is Daniel." Mark studied him with the quiet alertness of a man who had spent his life reading people quickly. "Daniel," he repeated slowly. Naomi appeared in the doorway behind them. "Mark," she said gently. Mark looked at her, then back at Daniel. "This the friend you mentioned last night?" Naomi nodded once. "Yes." Mark's eyes moved back to Daniel. "You came a long way to visit." Daniel stepped closer to the bed. "I did." Mark gave a faint smile. "Well, anyone Annie trusts that quickly can't be all bad." Annie climbed onto the edge of the bed beside him. "He drove 4 hours." Mark raised an eyebrow. "Did he now?" Daniel nodded slightly. "I owed your family a visit." Mark glanced at Naomi. "That so?" Naomi met his gaze calmly. "Yes." Mark seemed to accept that explanation. He looked back at Daniel again, studying him more closely this time. "You look like a businessman." Daniel smiled faintly. "I suppose that's accurate." "What kind?" "I run a technology company in New York." Mark let out a quiet whistle. "Well," he said slowly, "that's a bit bigger than Harbor Point." Annie looked proud. "Daniel has a really important job." Mark chuckled softly. "I'm sure he does." Daniel noticed the oxygen machine beside the bed and the small tray of medications on the nightstand. "Naomi mentioned you've been dealing with some health problems," Daniel said gently. Mark shrugged slightly. "Comes with the territory when you spend 20 years breathing construction dust." Naomi stepped closer. "You don't have to talk about that right now." Mark waved a hand lightly. "I've had plenty of practice." He looked back at Daniel. "Doctors say my lungs are about as useful as an old fishing net." Daniel frowned slightly. "Are you receiving proper treatment?" Mark gave a small laugh. "This is a small-town hospital situation." Daniel understood what that meant immediately. Limited resources, long waiting lists, the kind of healthcare system that worked best when people had time and money. Two things Naomi had clearly been short on. Mark studied Daniel again. "You look like a man who's trying to solve something." Daniel met his gaze calmly. "I usually am." "Well," Mark said, leaning back against the pillows, "life in Harbor Point isn't a problem you can fix with a spreadsheet." Daniel smiled slightly. "I'm starting to see that." Annie slipped her hand into her father's. "Daniel keeps promises," she said proudly. Mark raised an eyebrow. "That right?" Daniel glanced at Naomi briefly before answering. "Yes." Mark nodded slowly. "Those are rare these days." Naomi stepped forward. "Mark." Daniel came because Annie called him last night. Mark blinked. "She did?" Annie nodded. "I found the phone in the drawer." Mark looked amused. "You've always been curious." Daniel reached into his jacket and placed the old phone on the small table beside the bed. Mark studied it. "That thing looks like it came from another decade." "It did," Daniel said. Naomi spoke quietly. "Daniel gave me that phone years ago." Mark looked between them. "Before you moved here?" "Yes." Mark nodded slowly. "Guess that explains why Annie found only one number in it." Daniel smiled faintly. "That was intentional." Mark looked thoughtful. "Well," he said finally, "seems like that old promise finally caught up with you." Daniel didn't deny it. "Yes," he said quietly. "It did." The room fell into a comfortable silence for a moment. Then Mark looked at Daniel again with a steady expression. "You seem like a decent man." "I try to be." Mark nodded. "Good." He glanced at Naomi and Annie, because these two deserve decent people around them. Daniel understood the meaning behind the words. Responsibility, trust, protection. I agree, Daniel said. Mark relaxed slightly into the pillows. Well then, he said with a smile. I suppose we'll see what happens next. Daniel looked at Naomi again, then at Annie, and for the first time since arriving in Harbor Point, he felt certain about something. This visit was not going to be a short one. Morning light filled the small bedroom as the conversation slowly came to a natural pause. The oxygen machine continued its quiet rhythm beside Mark's bed, a steady mechanical breathing that reminded everyone in the room that time, health, and strength were things no one could control forever. Daniel stood near the foot of the bed, hands loosely in his pockets, while Annie remained seated beside her father. Naomi leaned against the doorframe, watching the three of them with a thoughtful calm that had settled over her since the night before. Mark studied Daniel for another moment. Then he gave a small nod. Well, he said, his voice still rough but steady. You didn't drive 4 hours just to introduce yourself. Daniel smiled faintly. No, I figured. Mark shifted slightly against the pillows. So what's the plan? Daniel glanced briefly at Naomi before answering. That depends on what your family needs. Mark chuckled quietly. That's a dangerous sentence. Why? Because most people who say it don't actually mean it. Daniel didn't respond right away. He had spent his adult life in boardrooms where people spoke in carefully crafted phrases that hid their true intentions. But this was not one of those rooms. I meant it, he said calmly. Mark seemed satisfied with that. Naomi finally stepped further into the room. Mark, she said gently. Daniel just arrived last night. I know, Mark replied. Maybe we shouldn't start solving the world's problems before breakfast. Mark gave a tired smile. Fair point. Annie looked between them. I'm hungry. Naomi laughed softly. That settles it. She turned toward the hallway. Breakfast first. Annie hopped off the bed immediately. I'll help. You'll help by washing your... Naomi, he said. The girl ran down the hallway. Mark watched her go with a soft expression that briefly replaced the exhaustion in his face. She's the best thing that ever happened to this house, he said quietly. Daniel nodded. I can see that. Mark turned his gaze back to Daniel. You know, he said slowly, small towns have a way of measuring people. Daniel tilted his head slightly. How's that? We watch what they do when things get difficult. Daniel understood. And? Mark shrugged slightly. You showed up. The simplicity of the statement carried more weight than any compliment. Daniel inclined his head slightly. I said I would. Mark nodded once more. Then maybe Annie was right about you. Daniel gave a small smile. Kids usually are. Naomi returned a moment later. Mark, you need to rest. I will. She adjusted the blanket over him with practiced care. Daniel could see how many times she had performed that same routine. Quiet responsibility. Every day. Daniel, Naomi said. The kitchen's this way. He followed her down the hallway. The house smelled faintly of coffee and toasted bread. Sunlight poured through the kitchen window, reflecting off the small harbor visible between two neighboring houses. Annie stood at the sink, drying her hands. I'm making pancakes, she announced proudly. Naomi raised an eyebrow. You're helping make pancakes. That's what I meant. Daniel took a seat at the small wooden table. The room felt simple and warm in a way Manhattan apartments rarely did. Naomi moved easily through the kitchen, measuring flour and cracking eggs into a bowl, while Annie stirred with enthusiastic determination. You cook every morning? Daniel asked. Naomi shrugged. Most mornings. That must take time. It's cheaper than eating out. Daniel nodded slowly. He had forgotten how carefully people sometimes had to plan ordinary meals. Annie looked over at him. Do you cook? Daniel smiled. I can make coffee. That's not cooking. I agree. Naomi laughed softly. Don't worry, she said to Annie. We'll teach him. Daniel leaned back slightly in the chair. I look forward to that. The batter was ready within minutes. Soon the small kitchen filled with the comforting smell of pancakes cooking on the stove. For a little while, the conversation remained light. Annie talked about school, her favorite teacher, the science project she was building about ocean tides. Daniel listened with genuine interest. Naomi watched the interaction quietly. Finally, Annie asked the question that had clearly been waiting in her mind. Daniel? Yes. Are you staying in Harbor Point for a long time? Naomi glanced toward him. Daniel considered the question carefully. I'm staying as long as I'm needed. Annie nodded as if that made perfect sense. That's good. Naomi placed a plate of pancakes on the table. Eat before they get cold. They began breakfast together. Simple food. Warm kitchen. Morning sunlight. Daniel realized something unexpected then. For years, he had believed success meant controlling every piece of his life with precision. But sitting in that small kitchen in Harbor Point, listening to a 6-year-old talk about school projects while Naomi poured coffee and the smell of pancakes filled the air, he felt something far more valuable than control. He felt connected. Not to a deal, not to a company, to people. Naomi sat down across from him. "Daniel," she said quietly once Annie became busy with her plate, "you don't have to fix everything." Daniel looked at her calmly. "I know. Then why are you still here?" He didn't hesitate. "Because walking away would mean breaking a promise." Naomi studied him carefully. "And you've waited 7 years to keep it." Daniel nodded. "Yes." Naomi leaned back slightly in her chair. Then she said something thoughtful. "Sometimes the hardest thing about promises isn't making them." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "What is it?" "Accepting the help that comes with them." Daniel understood what she meant, and he knew the next chapter of this story was only beginning. Morning lingered longer in the small kitchen than Daniel expected. In Manhattan, breakfast usually lasted 5 minutes coffee, a glance at emails, a quick car ride to an office tower where the day began with urgency. But here in Harbor Point, time moved differently. Annie finished her pancakes first and pushed her plate away proudly. "I made those," she reminded Daniel. "You did an excellent job," Daniel said. Naomi raised an eyebrow. "You stirred the batter. That's still cooking." Daniel nodded solemnly. "I agree." Annie grinned and hopped down from the chair. "I'm going to get ready for school." Naomi looked surprised. "You remembered?" "Of course," Annie said. "Mrs. Delgado said being late 3 times means extra homework." "That's a strong motivator," Daniel said. Annie ran down the hallway, leaving the 2 adults alone at the table. The kitchen grew quieter again. Naomi wrapped her hands around her coffee mug. "You're good with her," she said. Daniel shrugged lightly. "She's easy to talk to." "That's because she trusts people quickly." Daniel nodded. "That can be a strength." "It can also be dangerous," Naomi said softly. Daniel understood. Children learned caution from the world around them, and Annie had grown up in a house where responsibility arrived early. "She's lucky to have you," Daniel said. Naomi gave a faint smile. "She thinks the same thing about me." Daniel glanced toward the hallway where Annie had disappeared. "Mark seems like a good man, too." "He is," Naomi said quietly. She took a slow sip of coffee before continuing. "When I moved here, I had nothing but a few suitcases and the phone you gave me." Daniel listened carefully. "Mark was one of the first people who helped me settle in," she said. "He fixed the broken heater in the house without asking for anything." Daniel nodded. "That says a lot." Naomi leaned back slightly in the chair. "He never asked questions about my past either." Daniel smiled faintly. "That says even more." Naomi studied him for a moment. "You're thinking about something." Daniel didn't deny it. "Yes." "What?" He folded his hands on the table. "Mark's treatment." Naomi's expression tightened slightly. "We're managing. With difficulty." She didn't argue. Healthcare in small towns often meant long drives and long waiting lists. Daniel spoke carefully. "There are specialists in Boston who work with advanced lung disease." Naomi Sehill. "Daniel, I'm not trying to take over," he said gently. "I know, but flying to Boston for medical treatment isn't exactly simple." "It could be arranged." Naomi shook her head. "That's the problem." Daniel leaned back slightly. "You think accepting help changes things." Naomi looked out the kitchen window. "The moment help comes from someone with your resources, everything changes." Daniel understood the concern. Money had a way of reshaping relationships, but silence had already reshaped theirs once. "I'm not offering charity," he said calmly. "What are you offering?" Daniel answered honestly. "A chance to make sure Annie keeps both of her parents as long as possible." The words settled heavily in the quiet kitchen. Naomi didn't respond immediately. She looked down at the table for several seconds. Then she spoke softly. "You always knew how to argue your case." Daniel smiled slightly. "I run a company. Persuasion is part of the job." Naomi looked up again. "But this isn't business." "No." "Then why push so hard?" Daniel didn't hesitate. "Because walking away again would be the easy choice." Naomi studied his face carefully. "And you've never liked easy choices." Daniel shook his head. "No." The hallway door opened again. Annie reappeared wearing a small backpack and holding a notebook. "Ready." Naomi blinked. "That was fast." "I brushed my teeth too." "Impressive." Annie walked over to the table. "Daniel, are you staying today?" Yes. Her eyes lit up. Good. She looked at Naomi. Mom, can Daniel walk me to school? Naomi hesitated. It was such a normal request, such an ordinary moment. But nothing about the situation was ordinary. Daniel waited patiently. Finally, Naomi nodded. If Daniel doesn't mind, I don't mind at all, he said. Annie grabbed his hand immediately. School is 2 streets away. Naomi stood and walked them to the front door. The morning air outside had grown warmer, and the harbor sparkled beneath the rising sun. Daniel and Annie started down the small sidewalk together. Halfway to the gate, Annie looked up at him. Daniel? Yes? Are you really going to help my dad? Daniel looked ahead at the quiet street. Yes. How? We'll figure that out. Annie thought about that. Then she nodded. That's what Mom says too. What does she say? She says when things get really hard, you just start solving one problem at a time. Daniel smiled. Your mom is very wise. They reached the small school building a few minutes later. Children ran across the playground while parents talked near the entrance. Annie turned before going inside. Thank you for coming, she said. Daniel knelt slightly so they were eye level. You're the one who called. Annie smiled proudly. Good thing I was curious. Daniel nodded. Yes, it was a very good thing. As Annie ran toward the school doors, Daniel stood quietly on the sidewalk. 7 years earlier, 2 phones had been given with a promise. Now that promise had finally been answered. And for the first time since that night on the Brooklyn Pier, Daniel Whitmore knew exactly what came next. He was going to keep it. This story reminds us that a true promise never expires with time. 7 years passed. Yet the simple commitment Daniel once made to answer if Naomi ever called remained alive in his heart. Life separated them. Pride kept them silent, and hardship built walls between their worlds. But in the end, it was the innocent curiosity of a child that reopened a door everyone believed was closed. The lesson is simple yet powerful. Loyalty, compassion, and the courage to show up for others can change lives. Success and wealth may shape a person's status, but character is revealed in quiet moments when someone keeps a promise, helps without expecting anything in return, and stands beside people who are struggling. In a world that often moves too fast to notice pain, this story reminds us that kindness and responsibility toward one another are the foundations of true humanity. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration only.